If you've ever wanted to experience a video game that had the ability to make you feel emotionally involved, even to the point where it sends you to tears, then The Walking Dead is for you. Based on the graphic novel by Robert Kirkman, Telltale Games' 2012 critically acclaimed point-and-click adventure game managed to pull players into a decaying world torn apart by a zombie apocalypse. From there, players were invited to follow the journey of Lee Everett, a former history professor who lived a modest life before being convicted for murder. The player assumed the role of Lee as he attempted to escape the never-ending nightmare while promising to take care of a young girl separated from her parents named Clementine. The Walking Dead succeeded in making players feel the trauma and desperation that human survivors went through as they searched for supplies and shelter that would give them a chance to survive the ravenous undead. The aim of this video is to take a critical analysis of Lee Everett's role in the story and to present an arguable thesis about the game's spiritual motif. That is, the curious notion that Lee is more of a guardian angel to Clementine than simply a guardian in the technical sense. In other words, this video will examine the opening and closing scenes of the game, which suggest that Lee survives in a state of purgatory as Clementine is his only hope for redemption. By guiding her back to her parents, his past will be absolved and allow him to move on. Whilst these ideas are clearly at risk of being too pretentious, it's important to stress the subjective and personal nature of this analysis to look beyond merely what we see on screen. Bear in mind, this is by no means what the developers intend. It's a personal view of the game's artistic merit. It's also worth stressing that this is not a biblical theory and no relation to any religious perspective is being made. God is not the subject matter, Lee is. In short, the general question is Lee Everett Clementine's guardian angel, as suggested through the notion that only his spirit ghost left the crash site? Firstly, it's best to compare elements of the final scene of No Time Left with the opening scene of A New Day, and how it suggests that Lee's human form never leaves the crash site. Figuratively speaking, the ironic image of Lee in handcuffs in the final scene infers to the metaphor that he has returned to his confinement in the police car. This is reinforced by how the jewellery store is an uninteresting location and lacks any profoundness, deliberately instilling that Lee never left the dark, claustrophobic forest he woke up in. Lee is not given a hero's burial or a leading man's deathbed. Instead, the player is presented with the reality that Lee is just another victim to the undead, hence his unceremonious ending is characterised by his conflicts and decisions, not by his hero status that the player and Clementine come to know. It also instills that Clementine's sadness transfers to the player as they shift their subjective perspective to her. In other words, as the player perceives Lee to be the archetypical hero, his status and importance are recognised. But in the context of the world, Lee has no impact, reflecting the notion that he has no control over anything that happens other than guiding Clementine. Furthermore, the suggestion that Lee never left the crash site is perpetuated by several parallel images. Metaphorically, the ornament falling on Lee makes him disoriented and stunned as a sign of his unconscious state, the one he woke up in the police car. The undead officer in the store is an obvious indicator of Lee's first confrontation with the undead, and the overwhelming number of walkers outside was the same as the sudden growing numbers seen in the forest. In addition, there is also two alternative images the player is left with when the game ends. Firstly, if the player chooses to have Clementine leave Lee to turn, then the final shot the player sees is Lee collapsing against a radiator in the exact same position he wakes up in when in the police car, while the officer in both scenes is lying face down. The mirror image continues the suggestive notion that Lee never left the crash site, and now that his purpose in the world is complete, i.e. guiding Clementine before she goes off on her own, he can finally rest. Conversely, if the player chooses to have Clementine shoot Lee, the shot of her firing the gun is reminiscent of the distant gunshot that attracts the walker's attention when Lee jumps over the fence in the first episode. In this occurrence, the distant gunshot acts like a foreshadow to the finale. The contrasting theme between the two is distance. The first episode gunshot is irrelevant and forgettable, but interestingly has a presence within the scene, while Clementine's gunshot is framed as a close-up to reflect the intimate bond between the two characters. It indicates that Lee's goal is complete and that Clementine is ready to move on, and by killing Lee, she no longer needs her angel. A final point to be made about the finale is how it plays out. Instead of the player making Lee complete the puzzle, the player makes Lee teach Clementine how to play a point-and-click adventure. In some essence, it breaks the fourth wall, but in its context, it's Lee completing his final duty by testing Clementine. Teaching her to fire a gun and cut her hair, in addition to other moments throughout the series, reflects Lee preparing Clementine for the ultimate test, which is complete following his death. From finding the bat to smash the window to taking the guard's gun to the abrupt life-threatening confrontation with a walker, they all follow a similar structure to the player's first time in control of Lee, showing that his guidance has been transferred to Clementine, whose journey has just begun. On a side note, prior to the car crash, during the conversation Lee has with the police officer, the same red truck as Sean's passes by, as does the same car owned by the stranger. Whilst this is likely to be due to design limitations and background looping, which is evident in similar vehicle designs throughout the series, it's still possible to make an interpretation. As the police car drives past them, it insinuates the inevitable deaths of Sean, the stranger, and his family. In this regard, throughout the series, Lee makes multiple attempts to save people only to eventually result in their deaths. It relates to the suggestion that Lee has no control over the fate of other characters, as he's simply an angel to Clementine, and in this respect, isn't necessarily there. Several other instances also allude to Lee having no control over others, as any attempt to do so is visually reflected. For example, when Lee cuts off David's leg, he later has the option to cut off his own arm, and when he injures his leg following the car crash, this is later reflected upon Ahmed, who hurts his leg when Lee pushes him off the bridge. There is also the consideration of the red herring of Doug and Carly. While Doug becomes a good friend and Carly becomes a love interest that develops Lee's character, they ultimately have an abrupt ending to their place in the story, leaving Lee to focus all his attention on Clementine. The demise of Doug and Carly means the lack of distraction for Lee as he continues to be tested as a guardian angel. It's almost like Lee is subtly becoming alienated from the other characters to show his lack of connection with the real world. In the end, Lee's decisions leave Clementine as the only original survivor of the group, and in this respect, it strengthens the view that Lee only exists to serve Clementine's interests, and the deaths of other characters are not Lee's fault, looking at it from a spiritualist point of view. Interestingly, the boy in the attic is an obvious symbol towards the fate of the group. During the scene, Lee acknowledges his importance in helping Clementine as he notices the state the boy was left in, including the lack of water, food, and as Kenny notes, the fact that the boy looks very much like Duck, reflecting everything the group has went through. This scene is less of a reflection on Lee than it is to show the fortunes the group actually had. The overarching theme of the series is about not taking life for granted, which is evident in how humanized the characters are, especially Lee, who is shown not to be a hero in the eyes of the group, but in the eyes of the player and Clementine. The burial of the boy alludes to the aftermath of Duck's death, and with Clementine watching at a distance echoes the image of what would have happened to her had she had not left the treehouse. This scene deliberately conveys to the player the difficult situations Lee had to make, such as taking supplies from the abandoned car, the death of Duck, and whilst not choice to the player, the decision to take responsibility for Clementine. Lee's purgatory becomes realised by putting him in a situation where he accepts and understands that he's being tested. Moreover, Ahmed and Krista become significant to the argument as it reinforces how Lee was never Clementine's true guardian in the technical sense. His goal as the guardian angel was ultimately to bring Clementine to Ahmed and Krista, who were to become Clementine's new family. A final thought to consider is the post-credits sequence. Clementine examines a shotgun shell she finds on the ground while witnessing two silhouettes in the distance, mirroring the exact same actions of Lee in the opening scene. It suggests that hope is ahead. Ahmed and Krista talked about heading to the countryside, and the fact that Lee's goal was to bring Clementine to them shows that Lee's task is complete. To support the view that the two silhouettes were hope, it's worth considering that the silhouette Lee saw in the opening episode was Clementine, justifying a positive ending. Clementine saved Lee from his prior self. His downfall as a man following the murder meant that he had nothing left. If the apocalypse didn't occur, Lee would have ended up in prison, so in this regard, the end of the world gave Lee a chance for absolution, freedom from guilt, suffering, and ultimately punishment. Clementine was perhaps the best thing that happened to Lee, as it proved that he was a good soul, and by allowing him the opportunity to spiritually guide Clementine to wishful salvation meant that his death was not in vain.
Don't be afraid.
In conclusion, The Walking Dead was not a story about surviving the zombie apocalypse. It was a personal tale about love, loss, and redemption. The game was an individual journey from the perspective of Lee Everett, an everyday guy who manages to come from the brink of self-destruction to prove he's worth something. Lee represents humanity, the good, the bad, the doubtful, and the inevitable. Clementine reflected the light at the end of the tunnel and represents the strength to carry on. The Walking Dead shows its long-term legacy as being a prominent illustration of the power of storytelling in a growing interactive art form. What the game encapsulates is a metaphor for human life. Don't give up. It doesn't attempt to convey this in a pretentious or overly profound manner, but instead manages to show the little things that provide hope. Lee's fate was sealed from day one, but his legacy will be echoed in the future of Clementine, whose story has just begun.